Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine standing at the crossroads where ancient magic, deep mysticism, and modern psychology all meet.
Right.
Not theoretically, but as lived, messy, practical experience. That's the incredibly unique world of Israel Regardie.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens when you get to sit down with someone like that, late in their life, asking them to look back on decades spent navigating these wild, sometimes contradictory, often profound territories?
It's something pretty special.
You get a rare distillation of wisdom, a fascinating blend of hard-won practical experience, and a razor-sharp, critical mind.
That's exactly the core of the journey we're taking today. Our source material for this deep dive centers around a significant late-life interview with Israel Regardie, conducted, well, not long before he passed away.
Ah, okay, so real late reflections.
Exactly. It captures his thoughts when he had nothing left to prove, really, and could speak with remarkable candor. But, the picture isn't complete with just that conversation.
Right, there's more.
Yeah, we're also drawing from introductions he wrote for books by various authors who were grappling with similar themes, people like Robert Anton Wilson, known for blending science and fringe ideas with humor.
Oh yeah, raw. Interesting connection.
Richard Satriano, who wrote about gnosis and semantics. Christopher S. Hyatt, who delved into areas like undoing the self. And even, crucially, introductions for books by Aleister Crowley, the figure he was so intertwined with.
Wow, okay. So the interview plus his thoughts on other people's related work.
And it doesn't stop there. We've also got insights from some of Regardie's own articles, offering his focused views on specific subjects critical to his worldview. Psychotherapy, the pitfalls of megalomania, the revolutionary ideas of Wilhelm Reich, and the enduring relevance of alchemy.
Okay, quite a range. So our mission here is pretty clear, but deeply ambitious. We're sifting through this rich collection of his final thoughts and written perspectives to pull out the absolute most important nuggets of knowledge and insight.
We want to understand Regardie's unique perspective on everything that mattered to him, from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which he, dedicated himself to preserving.
A huge task in itself.
Huge. To the nuances of human psychology and therapy, the nature of consciousness, and even the underlying reality of existence itself. It's about extracting the practical wisdom, the so what, from a lifetime of incredibly diverse study and, intense personal experience.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, to being well-informed on this complex individual and his ideas, seen through his very specific lens, one that, as the sources make clear, always prioritized practical experience and rigorous critical thinking over mere belief or, just intellectual abstraction.
Right. For him, knowledge wasn't just something you collected, it was something you did. It had to produce tangible results, whether internal or external.
Which brings us right to the man himself, who was Israel Regardie. The sources paint a picture of someone shaped by an almost dizzying array of influences and areas of study, a confluence that seems, almost designed to force synthesis.
Absolutely. You see this convergence manifest throughout his life. He was raised in Christian Science, a faith fundamentally based on the idea that spiritual understanding impacts physical reality.
Okay, so right from the start, mind-body is in there.
Right. This already gives you a unique starting point, a focus on mind-body connection, albeit through a specific theological lens. Then he moved into Theosophy, another major mystical and philosophical movement of the late 19th and early 20th century.
Blavatsky and all that.
Exactly, which exposed him to Eastern philosophies, Kabbalah, and the idea of hidden knowledge and spiritual evolution.
So he's already got this blend of Western Christian-derived metaphysics and Eastern esoteric philosophy brewing.
Exactly. And from there, his early and perhaps most historically significant involvement was with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
The big one.
Yeah, a key Western esoteric order that combines ceremonial magic, Kabbalah, astrology, tarot, Egyptian magic, among other disciplines. This wasn't just reading. This was an intensely practical system of ritual and internal work.
And, of course, he famously became secretary to Aleister Crowley.
Right. A man who personified the intersection of genius, excess, and deep magical knowledge. Working with Crowley alone would have been a crash course in applying magical principles, for better or worse.
I can only imagine. Must have been intense.
Indeed. It put him right into the crucible of magical practice at a high level, observing and participating in the life of one of the most controversial figures in occult history. But even this wasn't enough for Regardie.
Still searching.
Yeah. He then took a decisive turn into the world of modern psychology. He studied Jungian analysis, underwent a considerable period of Freudian therapy, and perhaps most impactfully for him, spent years in Reichian therapy.
He didn't just dip his toe in then.
Not at all. He didn't just study these. He experienced them personally, deeply, and he became a practicing psychotherapist himself.
So let's list that out. Christian Science, Theosophy, Golden Dawn Magic, working with Crowley, then Jung, Freud, Reich, and clinical practice. Wow. On the surface, those fields seem so different. Religion, mysticism, ceremonial magic, psychoanalysis, body therapy. How could someone possibly bridge those seemingly disparate worlds? What was the driving force behind that synthesis?
That's precisely the central theme the sources highlight. Regardie wasn't content to let these fields remain separate islands of knowledge. He actively sought to synthesize them: science, social thought, philosophy, psychology, and the occult.
You wanted it all to connect somehow.
Pretty much. His fundamental belief, which shines through in the interview and his writings, was that knowledge fragmented is knowledge diminished. It's most valuable, most potent, when it's not just understood intellectually within its own silo, but actually applied and integrated across different domains, particularly the inner and outer worlds of the individual.
It sounds like he was trying to build a kind of, unified theory of human transformation.
In a sense, yes. He saw the same underlying processes or goals appearing in different forms across these disciplines. The sources point to Robert Anton Wilson's work as a modern example of this kind of desired synthesis.
Raw again.
Yeah, blending quantum physics, psychology, conspiracy theories, and humor, all aimed at expanding consciousness and questioning reality tunnels. Regardie clearly appreciated Wilson's ability to cross boundaries and make connections in unexpected ways. It resonated with his own drive to see how it all fit together.
So he wasn't interested in being just an occultist or just a therapist. He wanted to see the whole picture.
Exactly. And his approach to this synthesis was deeply pragmatic, driven by his stated preference, which is a constant refrain in the source material. He prefers experience rather than the explanation of experience.
Doing over talking.
Right. He talks about being trained in a scientific and analytic fashion. This wasn't about abstract philosophy or blind faith. It was about what you do, the techniques you employ, and the results you get. He explicitly contrasts this with purely theoretical or prosaic approaches described in the source, those who are content to intellectualize endlessly without ever, getting your hands dirty, so to speak, without doing the actual work.
That preference for the practical, the experiential, really seems to be the bedrock of his entire perspective. It defines who he was.
It absolutely does. The sources consistently portray him as a voice of reason, a grounded figure within fields often prone to fantasy, excess, or simple delusion.
Yeah, the occult world can definitely go.
Oh, for sure. He had this remarkable, almost unique ability to synthesize vast amounts of diverse information, spot the underlying patterns, and connect the dots between areas that most people would never dream of putting side by side. He wasn't just interested in knowing what something was, but why it mattered, how it worked in practice, and what tangible effect it had on the individual.
Okay, let's zero in on one of the areas he's most famous for, perhaps the one he's most historically significant for. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. His work preserving that material was monumental, almost an act of historical salvage.
It truly was. According to the source material, Regardie's primary burning motivation for undertaking the immense task of compiling and publishing the complete Golden Dawn system of magic was a deep, urgent concern that this incredibly important body of Western esoteric knowledge was facing imminent extinction.
Well, extinction.
That's how he saw it. He saw Western civilization, particularly in Europe in the mid-20th century, heading towards, as he put it in the interview, the point of utter dissolution. He anticipated cataclysms like World War II, which indeed occurred.
Right in that period.
And feared that this knowledge, much of it held in private hands, archives, and scattered across the UK, would simply be destroyed or disappear forever due to war, neglect, or secrecy.
So it wasn't just an academic interest. It was a desperate race against time to save something precious he believed was essential.
Precisely. It was an immense undertaking, requiring incredible effort to gather and organize all that complex material, the rituals, the lectures, the diagrams, the Kabbalistic correspondences. It's huge.
I bet.
The source includes a fascinating, almost cinematic anecdote about how he collaborated with a man named Carr P. Collins Jr. in Dallas to achieve this. Collins was a successful businessman with an interest in the Kabbalah and the Golden Dawn system,
Okay.
and he wanted to learn the correct pronunciation of the Hebrew words used in the rituals.
Pronunciation, that sounds like a very specific point of entry into something so vast.
It is, and it provided the practical impetus. Regardie suggested to Collins that the best way forward was to get the original Golden Dawn material transcribed from old manuscripts. Collins was willing to fund the effort.
Funding always helps.
Definitely. Regardie recounts that perhaps trying to test the waters or simply reflecting the value of his time and knowledge, he initially suggested what he thought was a preposterous fee, $500 per day, thinking Collins would balk.
Which would have been a fortune back then.
Oh, yeah. But to Regardie's surprise, Collins readily agreed.
Wow. Okay, so Collins was serious.
It's very serious. So Regardie went to Dallas, stayed with people he found very congenial, and then in a marathon session that highlights his dedication, he spent 48 hours continuously dictating the entire Golden Dawn corpus into a tape recorder for transcription.
48 hours straight.
Yeah.
Dictating.
Yep. He mentions being surprised that his hosts didn't ask him to stop or leave him alone, given the intense, nonstop nature of the work he was doing in their home.
Wow. That single anecdote really brings home the scale of the project and the intensity of his commitment. He essentially pressed pause on everything else in his life to ensure this material saw the light of day.
He did. It speaks volumes about how important he felt it was to preserve this system and make it accessible even to the general public rather than seeing it locked away in secret societies.
Right, get it out there.
Now, while he dedicated himself to preserving the Golden Dawn system itself, he also had some quite pointed critiques of the order and, perhaps more so, of many of its practitioners. Okay. Not all sunshine and roses.
Not at all. The source material discusses the Golden Dawn's stated purpose, which Regardie saw as genuinely noble and profound.
What was that stated purpose, according to him?
As presented in the sources, the ultimate goal of the Golden Dawn system was to give them more insight into their meaning, into their significance, into their functions as human beings of developing a whole person.
So self-knowledge integration.
Exactly. The idea was to help individuals transcend the ordinary limitation of the unenlightened human state and achieve a higher so-called cosmic consciousness, ultimately aiming to become, in his words referencing the system's ambition, more than human. This transformation was to be accomplished through systematic, rigorous exercises, meditation, and ritual practice, a complete system of self-development.
That sounds like an incredibly high aim, a huge undertaking for anyone. Where did the disappointment creep in?
His profound disappointment, as described vividly in the source material, wasn't with the system itself, but with many of the people who were drawn to occultism in general and the Golden Dawn specifically. The practitioners.
Right. He calls them, sometimes dismissively, dilettantes and unbalanced people. His criticism was that many were using occult practices not as a path for genuine self-transformation, but as a means of escaping from their fundamental personal, emotional, and psychological problems.
Uh-oh. Using magic as a crutch or escape?
Pretty much. They were seeking power, fantasy, or belonging without first doing the difficult, often painful, inner psychological work necessary to build a stable foundation.
So they were trying to build a spiritual penthouse on a psychologically crumbling foundation. That's a classic problem, isn't it?
Exactly. They were seeking external effects or internal feelings of grandeur without addressing the neuroses and emotional blockages that were actually holding them back. This was a major recurring criticism for him.
Makes sense.
And this ties directly into the tension the source describes between the Golden Dawn's inherent elitism and Regardie's eventual desire for broader accessibility. The order, by its very nature and the demands of its curriculum, was elitist in a specific sense, meaning it required a certain level of dedication, intelligence, perseverance, emotional stability, and courage from its members. These were the qualifications, based on effort and capability, that defined its elite.
That doesn't sound unreasonable.
Yeah.
Any demanding discipline requires certain qualities from its students. You wouldn't expect just anyone to become a theoretical physicist overnight.
Right. But the source contrasts this necessary form of elitism based on qualification and effort with a different kind of approach that Regardie strongly criticizes.
Which is?
What he derisively calls sweet and light occultism.
Sweet and light, okay.
This isn't about having qualifications. It's about actively avoiding difficulty, conflict, and unpleasant truths. It's wanting things to be superficially positive, harmonious, and easy, a refusal to confront the shadow side of oneself or reality.
Yeah, this sort of toxic positivity approach applied to magic.
Exactly. According to Regardie in the sources, this sweet and light attitude, This unwillingness to do the hard psychological excavation was fundamentally limiting and actively prevented real progress towards that deep goal of becoming a whole, integrated, more than human person.
So it was shallow.
Deeply shallow in his view. He released the Golden Dawn material precisely because he believed that even if many people who accessed it were sweet and light dabblers, at least the knowledge would be available for those few who were truly qualified by character and determination and willing to do the deep work.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't force someone to commit, but you can make the tools available to those who are ready when they find them. Better out there than lost forever.
Exactly. And this brings us squarely to the critical intersection that was so foundational for Regardie, the meeting point of psychology and the occult arts. He returned to this theme constantly in his later life.
So he didn't see them as antagonistic or mutually exclusive fields, but deeply intertwined.
Not at all. He saw them as profoundly connected, even necessary for one another to be truly effective. His strongest critique, as we touched upon, was reserved for occultists who deliberately avoided psychological work, those who were sweet and light and refused to look inward.
Right. One's avoiding the difficult stuff.
Yeah. He felt this approach was not just superficial, but actively delusional, lacking any real grounding in the reality of the human psyche, and therefore preventing them from making any authentic progress in the great work of spiritual development. You simply could not, in his view, build a solid, integrated spiritual structure if your underlying psychological foundation was unstable, riddled with unresolved trauma, neuroses, and unacknowledged emotional blocks.
And he spoke from deep personal experience on this, having undergone various forms of intense therapy himself. This wasn't just theory for him.
Yes, this is an absolutely key part of the source material, adding significant weight to his arguments. He was remarkably open about his personal therapeutic journey, a year of Jungian analysis, 4 years of Freudian analysis, and a further 4 years of Reichian therapy.
9 years total. Wow.
Yeah, extensive personal journey through different therapeutic modalities wasn't just tangential. It deeply informed his views on human nature, healing, and the relationship between the psyche and spiritual work.
Let's start with his take on Jungian analysis. He famously called his year of it useless. Why such a harsh assessment? That sounds pretty dismissive of Jung.
Well, his critique, as presented in the source interview, is quite specific. He felt that while Jungian analysis was intellectually rich and provided immense insight, he describes it being very much about making notes and highlighting key points in Jung's literature. It fundamentally lacked a concrete technique for actually working with the contents of the unconscious.
The practical element again.
Exactly. Particularly dream figures or internal images in a dynamic, transformative way. It felt to him more like intellectual exploration and interpretation about the psyche, rather than a practical method for engaging directly with it to effect change. He felt there wasn't a clear method given to do something with the archetypes or symbols once identified.
So lots of mapping and understanding the territory, but no real tools for traversing it, in his experience.
Precisely, according to his personal experience of it. He contrasts this sharply, almost emphatically, with his experience in Reichian therapy. He spent 4 years undergoing this form of body-oriented psychotherapy and found it incredibly valuable, even transformative.
4 years?
Yeah.
Okay, what made the Reichian approach so different and effective for him, where Jungian analysis fell short in his eyes?
The source states that the Reichian therapy experience gave him a powerful philosophy, likely referring to Reich's understanding of energy, emotion, and the body that remained valuable throughout his life.
Okay.
Interestingly, he notes that the Reichian work actually made him delve deeper into Jungian literature after his therapy was completed.
Huh, that is interesting.
Suggesting it perhaps opened him up to Jungian ideas in a new, more receptive way, maybe having cleared some internal blockages first. But the critical distinction, the reason he found it not useless, was that it provided concrete technique.
There's that word again. Technique.
Right. He specifically mentions scrying, which he describes in the source as working with dream figures or internal images, not as mere symbols or illusions, but as if they are real entities or forces to be engaged with.
Like active imagination.
Sort of, yeah. And the practice of active imagination, which is a Jungian-derived technique, but one he felt was utilized more effectively or practically in his Reichian context. He saw this as a powerful, direct method for engaging with the contents of the psyche, something he felt was was missing in his Jungian analysis experience alone. He draws a stark contrast between this active, dynamic engagement and what he rather bluntly calls plain masturbation,
Oof.
suggesting a superficiality to purely mental or intellectual engagement without a real technique for dynamic interaction with the unconscious.
Okay, that's a vivid comparison.
Yeah.
So Reichian therapy provided that hands-on, experiential, even somatic component that was so central to his value system. It got him doing the work internally, in the body.
Exactly. It was a method that directly engaged with the body and emotions, breaking down physical and energetic blockages, which, for Regardie, was essential groundwork for any kind of higher spiritual development. This leads naturally into his summary of Wilhelm Reich's key concepts, as derived from the source, particularly from his article on Reich.
What were the main takeaways about Reich in his system, according to Regardie? Because Reich is another controversial figure.
He certainly is. The source summarizes several core Reichian concepts that Regardie found valuable. First is the concept of character armor.
Okay, I've heard that term.
Yeah, it's the idea that repressed emotions, psychological defenses, and unresolved traumas aren't just abstract mental states, but are held physically in the body as chronic muscular tension or energetic blockages. It's like the body itself develops an armor to contain painful feelings.
The body remembers what the mind tries to forget, kind of thing.
In a way, yes, and it holds it as physical bracing actual tension. Second is Reichian therapy itself, or vegetotherapy, as Reich sometimes called it. This was the method developed specifically to release this character armor.
How did it work?
According to the source, it often involved direct physical manipulations, deep breathing exercises, and emotional release work aimed at breaking through these bodily tensions and freeing up the bound emotional energy. Regardie clearly saw this as a powerful and necessary technique for liberating the individual.
So it's literally hands-on work to release physical blocks that are holding back psychological and emotional flow. Sounds intense.
It could be very intense, yes, precisely. And the sources also mention Reich's concept of orgone energy.
Ah, yes, the orgone boxes and all that. That's where it gets really out there for some people.
Well, yes, the later developments are controversial, but Regardie focused on the core therapeutic concept. Orgone as a fundamental life energy, a vital force that flows through the body and is intimately connected to emotional states and physical health. Blocks in this energy flow, held by the character armor, lead to psychological and physical problems.
So it was about releasing not just psychological baggage, but also the physical and energetic manifestations of that baggage.
Yeah.
Getting the energy flowing freely again.
Exactly. The source material explicitly contrasts Reichian therapy with the more traditional talking cures like Freudian or Jungian analysis, highlighting that Reich's approach was more somatic, more direct in confronting and releasing emotional and energetic blocks held in the body, rather than primarily relying on verbal interpretation.
Which fits perfectly with Regardie's emphasis on doing and experience.
Perfectly.
And Regardie saw this kind of deep psychological and somatic work, this release of character armor and emotional blocks, as absolutely integral, not optional, for the great work, the spiritual development process.
Absolutely. This is perhaps his most emphatic point. He viewed psychotherapy, and particularly methods like Reich's that addressed the body and character armor, not just as a preliminary step, but as an essential integrated part of the great work.
Not just something you do before magic, but as magic, in a way.
Or at least as an essential preparation and ongoing maintenance. His article, What is Psychotherapy?, summarized in the source, details the wide range of physical and emotional symptoms that, in his view, stemmed from unresolved psychological issues and that therapy could address.
Like what?
Everything from seemingly physical ailments like chronic headaches, fatigue, and heart palpitations, to obvious emotional distress like anxiety, depression, phobias, and difficulties in social relationships. He saw these as manifestations of deeper, unresolved emotional and psychological problems, not just isolated physical or mental illnesses.
So for him, many common physical and emotional problems were essentially symptoms of a blocked or armored psyche, the body expressing the inner conflict.
That's the clear implication from the source. He also levels a critique against the standard medical model for psychological issues, which he felt often focused too much on symptom management rather than addressing the root causes in the character structure and emotional history.
Treat the symptom, not the cause.
Right. And he had a particularly strong opinion, mentioned in the sources, on chiropractors presenting themselves as psychological healers.
Really?
Yeah, seeing it as outside their legitimate domain and training, suggesting that superficial physical manipulation wasn't sufficient to address deep psychological armor. You needed the emotional and energetic release work, too.
That's a very strong stance.
Mhm.
So for Regardie, you really couldn't hope to achieve higher spiritual states or make progress in profound magical work if you were weighed down literally and energetically by unresolved neurotic problems and character armor.
Correct. The inner psychological landscape had to be confronted, cleared, and integrated first, or at least concurrently with spiritual practices. Trying to do otherwise was, in his view, building on sand. Pointless, even dangerous.
Let's shift gears slightly and look at how he viewed the key figures who influenced him or were part of his world. Moving from psychology to the people who shaped the occult landscape he inhabited, he had remarkably nuanced, often critical views on the masters he worked with or studied under. Aleister Crowley, for instance, is a complex, towering figure in Regardie's personal story and in occult history. How did he frame Crowley in these later reflections?
Very much so. The sources reveal Regardie held a complex, almost paradoxical view of Crowley. On one hand, he absolutely acknowledged Crowley's undeniable importance and monumental contribution to magical knowledge. He refers to Crowley as a master of magic, recognizing his profound genius and the depth of his insights into occultism.
He respected the work.
Immensely. Regardie felt a clear compulsion, a duty even, to preserve Crowley's work, seeing him as a pivotal, unavoidable figure in the history of Western occultism whose contributions needed to be available.
But that wasn't the entire picture. He didn't idolize him, clearly.
Not at all. While preserving the work, Regardie was also remarkably clear-eyed, even critical, about Crowley's character flaws and personal excesses. He doesn't shy away from discussing Crowley's chaotic lifestyle, his issues with drugs and sex.
Usual criticisms.
Right, and describes him, in the source, as a wanderer of the wastes, suggesting a brilliant but ultimately unstable and perhaps self-destructive figure. The sources include pointed anecdotes, like a letter referencing Crowley owing money or descriptions of his general unreliability and chaotic energy, which Regardie felt contributed to difficulties within the occult field and caused problems for those around him.
So genius magician, terrible role model.
That's maybe putting it starkly, but yeah, something like that. Regardie preserved the magic and the system, despite the personal failings of the man who embodied much of it.
It sounds like he had to perform a difficult separation, valuing the transmission of knowledge while being honest about the vessel. That takes a certain maturity.
He did, and it was essential to his project of preservation. He also discusses other significant figures. For example, H.P. Blavatsky, whose theosophy provided his early background before the Golden Dawn.
Right, back to the beginning.
He clearly respects her influence, but notes a critique in the source regarding what he perceived as a moral dichotomy or contradiction in her life or actions, suggesting a gap between her high-minded teachings and aspects of her personal life.
Another case where the teacher's life didn't fully align with the teachings, perhaps. Or just acknowledging human complexity.
Potentially the latter, or at least acknowledging the complexity and imperfections even in founders of movements. He wasn't looking for saints. He also provides a contrast to figures like Crowley and himself by discussing Arthur Edward Waite.
Ah, Waite of the Rider-Waite Tarot deck fame.
Exactly. Another significant figure in the Western esoteric tradition, particularly known for his work on the Tarot and the Holy Grail. The source describes Waite as rigid, highly moralistic, and deeply steeped in Christian orthodoxy.
Very different vibe from Crowley.
Totally different. Regardie notes that many people in the esoteric world disliked Waite precisely for this perceived rigidity, which stood in contrast to the more experimental, dynamic, or less overtly moralistic approaches of others like Crowley, or indeed Regardie's own synthesis.
Yeah, so Regardie seems to have valued flexibility, practical application, and perhaps a less dogmatic approach, more than rigid adherence to doctrine or conventional morality. Seems consistent.
Absolutely. His critiques and observations are always filtered through his lens of practical efficacy and personal honesty. He also interacted with or commented on other figures mentioned in the sources with specific viewpoints. He was dismissive of Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science in his later years, seeing it as ultimately divorced from practical reality compared to his own experience.
Moved beyond his starting point there.
Yeah. He appreciated Robert Anton Wilson's capacity for synthesis and humor, seeing him as someone else trying to bridge disparate fields. He discussed Richard Satriano's work on gnosis and semantics, engaging with how language shapes understanding in spiritual contexts. And he acknowledged Christopher S. Hyatt's approach to undoing yourself and energized meditation, seeing resonance with the need for psychological work and active internal practice.
So he was constantly evaluating different approaches based on his core criteria of experience and practical results. Did it work? Did it make sense in the real world?
That seems to be the bottom line for him, yeah.
This brings us neatly to Regardie's overarching tactical philosophy and core beliefs, the principles that seem to knit together all these diverse influences and critiques.
Indeed. At the very heart of his philosophy is that unwavering, almost insistent belief in the primacy of experience over theory.
We keep coming back to that.
Because he kept coming back to it. He wasn't interested in abstract philosophical debates that didn't lead to tangible changes in the individual or their life. He makes repeated statements, emphasized in the source, prioritizing doing the work, the magical exercises, the rituals, the meditation, the therapy, over just talking about it, reading about it, or intellectualizing endlessly.
Get your hands dirty.
Right. He felt far too many people in the occult and even psychological fields were content with discussion and analysis without ever getting down to the difficult, often tedious work of practical application.
And this circles right back to his strong stance against the sweet and light approach, doesn't it? His pet peeve almost.
Absolutely. He saw that superficially positive, anti-confrontational approach not just as annoying or naive, but as actively detrimental to any real progress. He linked it directly to a fundamental unwillingness to face reality, to confront one's own shadow, to deal with pain or difficulty.
Spiritual bypassing, essentially.
Pretty much. In his view, this prevents the kind of deep integration and psychological transformation that is necessary for the great work. It results in a lack of depth, a fragile, ungrounded spirituality that crumbles when faced with real-world challenges or internal crises. It's a denial of the full, often difficult spectrum of human experience that must be embraced for growth.
Speaking of embracing the full spectrum, he also had very specific interpretations of key concepts from the traditions he worked with, like Crowley's famous dictum, "Love is the law, love under will." How did he unpack that?
From the source material, Regardie's interpretation of this principle explicitly and forcefully rejects any notion of sloppy sentimentality as being this love.
So not warm fuzzies.
Definitely not just warm fuzzies. He emphasizes that love in this context is not about just getting along, being passively nice, or avoiding conflict. It's described as a dynamic, active principle. It's a force, perhaps the fundamental energetic force of existence that underpins and empowers one's true purpose or will. It encompasses the full range of human experience, including confrontation, difficulty, and the challenging work of integration, because all of this is necessary for growth and the fulfillment of that underlying will. It's love as a force for being, for doing, for becoming, not just for feeling nice.
So love as a potent driving force for dynamic interaction and purposeful growth, not just passive affection. That's a significant reframing from how it's often understood.
It is, and it aligns perfectly with his emphasis on practical, dynamic work. And the source material also directly addresses the topic of sex, which is often fraught with difficulty and misunderstanding, particularly in spiritual contexts.
Always a tricky subject.
Right. Regardie's view, as presented, is that sex, like any powerful human energy, emotional, physical, mental, is meant to be understood, integrated, and consciously directed within the framework of the great work, rather than being a source of shame, neurotic problems, obsession, or repression.
It's about conscious integration rather than repression or obsession, handling that energy constructively.
Exactly. He critiques certain religious views on sex, particularly what he identifies as a traditional Christian perspective, seeing it as overly focused on sex as the root of evil. His view, based on the sources, is that this creates neurotic problems and diverts energy that could otherwise be used constructively. It should be a powerful, integrated part of the fully developed human being, not something to be feared or suppressed.
That leads us into his view on evil itself, which seems tied to that critique of Christian views on sex.
It does. The source material discusses his perspective on evil in relation to concepts like black and white magic, and specifically links it to his critique of certain Christian viewpoints. It's presented as stemming from narratives like the Adam and Eve story, where the acquisition of knowledge, often metaphorically linked to sexual knowledge, is seen as the original sin and the beginning and end of evil.
The fall narrative.
Right.
Regardie reports on this historical view influencing the occult field, presenting it as a dualistic, perhaps limited perspective on morality and magic, rather than necessarily endorsing it as an absolute truth. He seems to see the real evil less in specific acts like sex and more in the fragmentation, the refusal to integrate, the avoidance of reality, the sweet and light stuff again that prevents wholeness.
So evil as disintegration or denial, rather than a specific taboo act. Interesting. What about drugs, particularly psychedelics, which were a significant part of the counterculture and spiritual exploration when this interview likely took place? Did he have thoughts on those?
He did. His perspective on drugs, particularly psychoactive substances, as presented in the source, is quite clear and consistent with his emphasis on effort and practical results.
Let me guess. Not a fan.
Pretty much. While acknowledging that substances like psychedelics might occasionally offer a glimpse or a taste of altered states of consciousness, or perhaps provide fleeting insights.
The door-opening idea. Right. He does not, under any circumstances discussed in the sources, recommend them as a reliable or beneficial method for engaging in the great work.
Why not? If they can provide a glimpse. Seems like a potential tool.
He views them essentially as a shortcut, an artificial one. They offer a temporary, chemically induced experience that bypasses the necessary effort, the discipline, the systematic practice required for real, lasting change and integrated understanding.
Earned versus given.
Exactly. The source suggests that the psychedelic state ultimately doesn't hold water ideologically, meaning it doesn't provide the deep, stable, integrated understanding or the character development needed to apply that glimpse in a meaningful, sustained way in everyday life. Compared to years of dedicated magical, meditative, or psychological practice, he saw drugs as resulting in very little real, profound, or permanent change.
Like seeing a picture of a mountain versus actually climbing it.
That's a good analogy. They might show you the door, but they don't give you the key or the ability to navigate what's inside once you step through. It's fleeting, not integrated.
So a temporary experience versus fundamental earned transformation. Makes sense within his framework.
Exactly. His focus was always on building something stable and lasting through consistent, disciplined effort. Sweat equity, you could say.
Beyond the personal and philosophical realms, the sources also touch on it. Regardie's broader views, his perspective on the state of Western civilization, the flow of knowledge through history, and even the enduring relevance of ancient practices like alchemy. He had some strong views on society.
He held a somewhat stark, even bleak perspective on the state of Western civilization, especially in the mid to late 20th century. As mentioned earlier regarding his motivation for preserving the Golden Dawn, he described civilization as having come to the point of utter dissolution, experiencing cataclysms, referencing wars and societal breakdown, and reflecting the shattered thought of mankind.
Dissolution, cataclysms, shattered thought.
Yeah, that sounds pretty pessimistic about the modern world. He was certainly unsparing in his critique of societal trends. He saw a fragmentation, a loss of cohesion and meaning. He referenced historical conflicts and religious persecutions, like the long, difficult history between Christians and Jews or the horrors of the Inquisition, as part of a deep-seated pattern of tension, antagonism, and suppression of knowledge and experience.
Seeing history repeating itself, in a way.
Or at least seeing the long-term consequences of these historical schisms playing out. However, even within this context, he saw enduring patterns and the potential for knowledge to resurface. This is where his views on alchemy become particularly relevant, as summarized in his article, Alchemy in the World Today in the Source.
Alchemy, right, not just turning lead into gold.
Not at all, according to Regardie and many scholars today. The source makes clear that the deeper, often hidden aim of alchemy was spiritual or psychological transformation, the great work of transforming the self, integrating the disparate base elements of one's being, like lead, into something unified, whole, and perfected, like gold.
The inner gold.
Exactly. This process was symbolized by the alchemical principle of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate the breaking down of elements followed by their recombination into a new, higher form.
Dissolving the old, coagulating the new, like breaking down the character armor and building something healthier.
Precisely. He presented alchemy, as described in the source, as another powerful example of the synthesis of material and spiritual work. Alchemists required practical effort, the laboratory work, often involving complex and dangerous chemical processes, alongside intense study and spiritual contemplation.
So theory and practice again, head and hands working together.
Right. It wasn't just intellectual, you had to do the physical and internal work simultaneously. This mirrors his views on magic and psychotherapy, requiring both study and practical application.
So alchemy is another historical example of his core theme, integration and practical application across different levels of reality. Makes perfect sense.
Absolutely. It's the same principle applied to a different symbolic and physical system. He also touched on the broader idea that knowledge, particularly occult or psychological knowledge that challenges prevailing paradigms, tends to be repressed, split apart, and driven underground throughout history.
Like the Golden Dawn knowledge he was trying to save.
Exactly. But crucially, it doesn't disappear entirely. It inevitably resurfaces, often in new forms, perhaps diluted or adapted. The source uses the example of Pentecostalism with its emphasis on direct spiritual experience, ecstatic states, and energetic phenomena as a potential modern resurgence, however distant from its origins, of suppressed practices and understandings related to the flow of knowledge and the embodied experience of the spiritual.
That's a fascinating connection, seeing historical religious movements as potentially linked to older, suppressed currents of knowledge and practice. It suggests a kind of underlying continuity, even if people don't recognize it.
It speaks to his view of knowledge and human drives as dynamic forces that find ways to re-express themselves despite attempts at suppression. And despite his critiques of civilization's state and the historical patterns of suppression, there are glimmers of hope detectable in the sources.
Oh, not all doom and gloom.
Maybe not entirely. Perhaps tied to the increasing accessibility of information, something he worked so hard to facilitate with the Golden Dawn material, and the potential for more people in the long run to stumble upon and engage in serious self-development, the great work. He acknowledges that profound progress happens slowly, not in decades, but over centuries.
Taking the long view.
Right. Suggesting a long view and the potential for future growth, despite present difficulties. It's not instant gratification.
So looking back at this incredibly rich and detailed deep dive into Israel, Regardie's final thoughts, what's the ultimate, most important takeaway for someone trying to make sense of his legacy? What's the core message?
I think the core takeaway, the most enduring insight, is Regardie's unique, perhaps unprecedented ability to bridge seemingly disparate worlds.
The magic and the psychology.
Right. The ancient wisdom and rigorous practice of the Western occult tradition and ceremonial magic, with the therapeutic insights and practical techniques of modern depth psychology, particularly body-oriented psychology like Reich's work. And he did it all grounded in a fierce, uncompromising commitment to practical results, personal experience, and intellectual honesty, rejecting fantasy and escapism.
It wasn't about picking a side, magic or psychology, but about seeing how they could inform and strengthen each other, building that bridge.
Exactly. The central message gleaned from these sources is that true growth, understanding, and transformation, the great work, comes from integrating these different aspects of knowledge and self. You can't effectively pursue deep spiritual development if you're psychologically fragmented, emotionally armored, or unwilling to face your own shadow. The psychological work is part of the spiritual work.
They aren't separate journeys.
Not for him. Regardie's legacy is showing how to attempt that synthesis and why it's essential.
And the source material itself, this interview and these carefully collected and introduced writings, really represent his final conscious effort to ensure that this perspective, this synthesis, and these tools for transformation continue to be available, understood, and utilized by others who are willing to do the work. He dedicated significant time and effort in his later years to seeing these projects through to publication.
He did. It was his way of leaving a roadmap, a toolkit, and a powerful argument for an integrated path to human potential, making sure it wasn't lost.
This has been a truly deep and fascinating look into the mind and final reflections of Israel Regardie. Thank you for guiding us through this complex material. It's given me a lot to think about.
My pleasure. It's a perspective that definitely offers a lot to ponder, doesn't it?
It really does. And that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to consider, drawn directly from the sources we've explored today. In our modern world, a world grappling with information overload and increasing specialization, where knowledge is often fragmented and psychological distress is widespread, how can you take a page from Regardie's book?
Yeah, how do you apply this?
How can you approach integrating seemingly separate fields like inner psychological work aimed at healing and wholeness, and broader spiritual, philosophical, or creative inquiry aimed at meaning and transcendence into your own life? It's about finding your own path to synthesis, committing to practical application, and being willing to do the deep, often difficult inner work required for genuine personal growth and a more holistic understanding of yourself and reality.
It's perhaps the most important work any of us can undertake, that integration.
Until next time, keep diving deep.